Chapter 2 of The Adventures of a Bear and a Great Bear Too. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Marie Christian. The Adventures of a Bear and a Great Bear Too, by Alfred Elwes. Chapter 2, Upon His Travels. There is no denying that when Bruin had got clear of the old familiar path and lost sight of the dwelling where he had hitherto spent his days, he felt most particularly uncomfortable, and if he had had the power of recalling the past, he would, in his present state of feeling, no doubt have done so. For the first time in his life, the sense of his ill temper struck him in all its ugliness, and as he sat down on a huge tree which was lying across his road, he looked such a picture of disconsolately that it was evident he would have felt great relief if he could have shed some tears. Alas, how much does Bruin's condition remind us of little scenes among ourselves! We give way to our bad tempers and our selfishness. We make ourselves disagreeable, and our friends unhappy. We quarrel, if we do not actually fight. And when we meet the reward of our waywardness, and find ourselves abandoned by those who would have loved us had we acted differently, we then moan over our fate, and bitterly regret what we might have avoided. Alas, poor human nature! Alas, poor bear! I am truly sorry to observe that no act of repentance followed Bruin's sense of desolation. His first feeling of sorrow over, he felt indignant that he should have been so treated. But, more than that, as he was still hungry, he felt regret at being denied a closer search into his old mother's larder. Whilst engaged in his various reflections, he happened to cast his eyes up to a neighboring hollow tree, where, at some height from the ground, a number of bees were flying in and out a great hole, with all the bustle and buzzing usual to those busy people. Now, it was well known that bears are mightily fond of honey, and will run great risks in order to obtain this dainty, and Bruin was very far from being an exception to his tribe. He was too ignorant to reflect that it was a great deal too early in the season to hope for any store, but, consulting only his own inclinations, he lost no time in climbing up the tree, and when he had reached the spot where the now angry bees were hurrying to and fro more vigorously than ever, he thrust his great paw into a hole with the hope of drawing forth a famous booty. But the indignant insects now came out in a swarm, and attacked him with the utmost fury. 3 of them settled on his nose, and pricked him most unmercifully. A dozen or 2 planted themselves on a great patch behind, where his trousers were worn thin, and a whole troop fastened onto the sore place in his head, for it was not quite healed up, and so stung him that, roaring with pain and rage, he threw himself, rather than descended, from the tree, and went flying through the wood to get rid of his determined little enemies. They stuck fast, however, to their points of attack, nor did Bruin get clear of his tormentors till he dashed himself into a pool of water and buried his head for a moment or 2 under the surface. It was with some degree of trepidation that he raised his nose above water and peeped about him. The bees were all gone, so he crawled out of the mud, and after an angry shake or 2, for his coat was quite wet, he resumed his journey. Bruin now travelled on till noon, and what with hunger and his long walk, you may believe his temper was not improved. A rustling noise on the left, accompanied every now and then with a short, contented kind of grunt, attracted his attention, and looking through some brambles, he descried in an open space a very large boar, with 2 most formidable tusks protruding from his jaws, busily engaged in rooting up the ground, from which he had extracted a curious variety of roots and other edibles, the sight of which made Bruin's mouth water. For the first time in his life he felt the necessity of civility, for though he had never made any personal acquaintance with the tribe to which the animal before him belonged, there were many tales current in his family of their ferocity when provoked, and the few reasoning powers he possessed were sufficient to assure him that not even his rough paws or burly strength would secure him from those glistening tusks if directed angrily against him. So Bruin resolved to try and be civil, and with this determination walked into the stranger's domain, and accosted him in as polite a way as his rude nature would permit him to assume. The animal, who was known in his neighborhood as Wild Boar Esquire, on account of the extent of his property, received Bruin's advances with great caution, for he was naturally of a suspicious temper, his bright reddish eyes twinkling in a very unpleasant manner. Perceiving, however, that this unexpected visitor was but a mere youngster, and that he looked very hungry and tired, he grunted out a surly sort of welcome, and jerking his snout in the direction of the heap of provisions, bade him squat down and make a meal. Bruin did not wait for a second invitation, but stretching out his huge legs, picked up the fresh vegetables, which he thrust into his capacious jaws with every appearance of relish. When his repast came to an end, and this did not happen till there was an end of the food, he wiped his mouth with the back of his arm and looked at the boar. And the boar, who had said nothing during the disappearance of the fruits of his morning's work, but had contented himself with uttering a grunt or two, looked at Bruin. At length he observed, "Her, you have a famous appetite." "Ah," answered the bear, "and so would you if you had not eaten anything for the last few weeks." After a pause, "Her, said Mr. Boar in a guttural voice. "I never tried, but a big fellow like you ought to be able to get through a deal of work." "Perhaps so," observed the surly bear, "but I don't intend to make the experiment." After another pause, "An idle fellow, I'm afraid," said Mr. Boar half aside, "and not quite so civil as before his breakfast." Then he exclaimed aloud, "I suppose you will make no objection to help me dig up some more food, seeing that you have made away with my dinner. "Who do you take me for?" said the ungrateful beast, springing to his legs and eyeing his entertainer with one of his furious looks. "Who do I take you for? You graceless cub!" exclaimed Mr. Boar in a rage, for he was rather hasty in his manner, and his red eyes twinkled, and his back began to get up in a way which showed his agitation. "Who do I take you for? Why, I did take you for one who would be at least thankful for the food given you when almost starving, but I now perceive you are only an ugly lump of a bear. Out of my sight this instant, or, from want of my own dinner, which you have devoured, I shall perchance make a meal of you. As he said these words, the bristles on his back started up so furiously, and his tusks glistened so horridly in a little ray of sunlight, which was peeping in to see what was the matter, that Master Bruin felt thoroughly frightened, and made a precipitate retreat, turning round at every few steps to observe whether he were followed, and if it would be necessary to take refuge in one of the trees. But Wild Boar Esquire only grunted out his favorite expressions, which, in this case, was mixed with a great deal of contempt, and recommenced digging for his dinner as if nothing had occurred to disturb his usual contented state of mind. Bruin now travelled on till he reached a stream which came bounding through this part of the wood at a very rapid pace, and making a terrible fuss because sundry large stones in the middle of its course rather impeded its progress. The noise it made, and the anger it showed, seemed to please our sulky bear mightily, so he sat down on the bank with his toes in the water to enjoy the spectacle. The scene was a very striking one, and was fitted to charm the most indifferent eye, and Bruin, bear as he was, could not help being attracted by it. Whatever his meditations, however, it was not destined that he should pursue them long without interruption, for his quick ear soon detected the sharp, quick bark of several dogs, a sound that was carried along by a breeze which swept by him at intervals. He raised his head with his huge nose in the air to sniff out any possible danger, and did not seem at all pleased with the result of his observations, for he drew first one foot and then the other out of the water, and raised himself to his full height. As he did so, a more than usual commotion in the stream drew his attention, when he perceived the round head of a large otter appear above the surface, whilst two bright eyes gave a hasty look all round. On observing Bruin, the head immediately disappeared, and at the same moment a whole pack of terriers, in hot haste, came sweeping round a bank hard by, but stopped short on finding themselves in the presence of such a formidable creature. Bruin perceived that he had made an impression, and his usual insolence returned, for he had at first been startled, and he attributed the pause of the terriers to fear, when, in fact, it was only the result of surprise. If he had been a little better physiognomist, he would have observed a certain air of determination about the little fellows, which sufficiently showed that it was prudence or a sense of duty which stayed them, and not a lack of courage. They had been sent out to procure an otter, and they were now deliberating among themselves whether it would be wise to spend their time in quarreling with a bear. After a short consultation, one who appeared to have the guidance of the pack uttered a decided little bark, and turning a little aside, endeavored to pass between Bruin and the stream, but sufficiently near to show that he was not afraid to come into contact with him, followed by his companions. This evidently contemptuous mode of treating him aroused all our ill-tempered hero's bad humor, so without considering the consequences of the action, he raised his big paw and knocked the leader down. The sturdy little fellows wanted no further provocation. As if influenced by a single will, they turned upon him and attacked him in front, flank, and rear, with an impetuosity which was at first irresistible because unexpected. Finding that those behind him were his greatest and most successful tormentors, he very prudently sat himself down, crushing one or two of them in his descent. Then springing to his legs, and as he did so catching several more in his arms, he hugged them till they had no more breath in their bodies, when he dropped them and took up a fresh supply. One of the pack, however, more alert than his fellows, sprang up and seized him by the nose, making his teeth meet in that prominent feature, and caused Bruin such intense pain that, forgetting all his strategy, he tried to beat down his determined little foe with his paws, and ran off howling in a most terrific manner, pursued by the remainder of the pack, who bit at his hind legs, tore his already ragged coat till it hung in ribbons. And when Bruin, who having at length got rid of the bold little fellow that had fastened to his nose, climbed up a tree, they stood yelping at the foot of it, till evening had completely set in, when they slowly retired. And what were our ill-natured hero's thoughts as he sat upon an elevated branch and gently rubbed his wounded snout? Why, unfortunately for his own happiness, he laid the blame of his mishap on any one or anything, rather than the right being or circumstance. It was the otter's fault, or the dog's fault. Those dogs were always so quarrelsome. Or it was his father's fault in driving him away from home. In fact, everyone was in error rather than himself and his own disagreeable disposition. And here we may observe that there are such characters as Bruin who bring disrepute on a whole tribe. For we are too apt to form our opinions of a nation by the few individuals we may happen to fall in with, although probably no conclusions can be falser. Let us therefore be careful ere we form our judgments, and let us not believe that all Bruin's kindred and compatriots were sulky and ill-tempered, because he himself was such a disagreeable lump of a bear. End of chapter 2.